Okay, I think we will make a start. So good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to either, I think it's our fifth, if not sixth, Friends of the British Overseas Territories webinar. We've got some fantastic two great speakers this evening. The event secretary will introduce them in a moment. But just to say, from my perspective, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Philip. I'm the Chief Executive of FOTBOT, and we obviously delighted to have you on this webinar this evening. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end. If you do have any concerns or anything, you can write a message as well. Please do mute yourself if you have not already done so. But without further ado, I'm going to now pass over to Lucia to introduce our guest speakers. Lucia.
Thanks very much, Philip. Hi all, thanks very much for joining us tonight. So we're delighted to have Pat and Chris joining us for our call from Cork Expeditions. So Pat is going to run us through all about South Georgia. We'll be hearing from him for around 20 to 25 minutes. So Pat has lived and worked on South Georgia for 25 years, during which he played a part in developing the island's procedures to manage fisheries, tourism, biosecurity and environmental management. After Pat's discussion, we'll also hear from Chris, who is the Business Development Manager from Cork Expeditions. And at the end, we'll also have the opportunity for Q&A, where I will read out any questions that you've posted in the Zoom chat. Just a few extra details. This webinar is recorded and we will post it on the FOTBOT page later this week. And we will also send contact follow-up details in an email at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Pat.
Very good evening. Thank you for inviting me here. First, what I'll do is I'll just introduce myself, and then I'll tell you a bit about South Georgia and how it's governed and managed. And hopefully you'll learn a little bit more about it. So the story is really about exploitation and recovery of this British Overseas Territory. So to set the scene, South Georgia is in the Southern Ocean, and that's where I've ended up working for a long time. But I started in that area a little earlier on when I left university in 1985 and went south with the British Antarctic Survey for 2 years at Halley Base as a geophysics technician, and learned quite a bit of programming and computer work while I was there. And after that, I went home to Britain, got married, looked for work abroad, and a job came up in the Falkland Islands. So my wife Sarah and I moved to Stanley, and we lived there for 3 years, where I worked with the Falkland Islands government, Fisheries Administration, using the bit of programming that I'd learnt to make the computers work for the different departments. So after 3 years, another job came up in South Georgia, which was a very, very small fisheries administration that was just starting up. And they needed just one person who knew how the licensing and data collection and could do a bit of computer work. And I was perfectly placed for that. So suddenly there I was on a 4-month contract in South Georgia, liked it so much that I did another one and ended up spending 25 years. So very, very lucky. Then I finished in about 2017 and have been doing mainly working with the expedition cruise ships, taking people back down to the Antarctic. So yeah, nearly 25 years then spent down in that part of the world on and off. So what's so special about South Georgia? It's in cold Antarctic waters, so it's just south of the Antarctic polar front or convergence, which means it's in colder water, and cold water can hold a lot of oxygen. So the warmer the water, the less oxygen it holds. In this cold water, there are a couple of currents. There's one current that comes through from the Bellingshausen Sea with one set of nutrients, and another current that moves circular motion around the Weddell Sea with different nutrients, and they meet up at the South Georgia area and hit some raised ground, which is the Andes that go westwards through South Georgia, then down through the South Sandwich Islands and back to the Antarctic Peninsula. And so this cold, deep water then gets mixed up and sent up to the surface, where it mixes with sunshine and just generates such a lot of life. There's a lot of living stuff in the sea, which is perfect conditions for life. So that starts off as plankton, very small algae, and that's eaten by small creatures such as Antarctic krill. Here's a bucket full of krill that I saw once taken out of a fishing vessel. And this is the central part of a food web of all the other marine creatures in the area. So there are fish, the massive whales, big whales, which can weigh, well, a huge amount, but they just eat these tiny little krill and small plankton. And then there are seabirds, the large albatross, the wandering albatross that live in the area, and then the smaller ones such as Wilson's storm petrel. They all survive because of all this amazing amount of food in the area. And also there are seals, so fur seals and elephant seals. So there's lots and lots of creatures all eating in the sea. But you can't just eat, creatures have got to breed. And luckily in that area there is a lovely lump of land where they can all go ashore to breed. Not only that, but there are even more nutrients, particularly iron, being washed out of the hills into the sea. So that feeds even more production of food. Also on the ground, also on the land, there are some terrestrial animals such as the pin-tailed ducks and pipits and invertebrates and plants. But the main thing is there's a big amount of land where all these animals can come and breed. So there are huge, huge colonies of the penguins. These are king penguins, but there are also gentoo, chinstraps, macaroni penguins. They all come ashore to breed. And then elephant seals, there are hundreds and thousands of elephant seals come ashore in October to have their pups, and the females feed their pups solidly for 3 weeks. Then once they've finished, the fur seals come ashore and they also have their pups and raise their young in December, January, February. So it's an incredibly fertile place. As well as the seals, then there are birds such as the albatross. Because it's far enough north that the sea doesn't freeze over, the wandering albatross and the larger birds can stay right round the summer, right round the winter, and can raise their young, because it takes pretty well a full year, maybe a bit more, to raise a chick, and they're able to feed all year round. So all in all, South Georgia has got an amazing amount of just stuff going on, all this life. So it was tickling along doing that forever until about 250 years ago when Captain Cook turned up and man started playing his part on the island. He wasn't very complimentary about the place. He wasn't very impressed with it. He was actually looking for the Antarctic continent and failed to do that, and was pretty disappointed when he only found South Georgia. So he didn't hang around, but when he did get home, he reported on the presence of the fur seals and the elephant seals, and it wasn't long before hunters came down to exploit that. So from the late 1700s onwards until the 1960s, and it got quite industrial. So by the end of the 1960s, there were huge shore-based stations processing the whales that were being caught out at sea. On the shore, the elephant seals and the fur seals were being hunted for their blubber and for their fur. And latterly, since about the 1980s until now, we've also been in there fishing for krill and for fish. So it's not a great human history. As well as exploiting it, the whalers with their stations, they had about 5, 6, 7 whaling stations on the shore. And to brighten up their lives, they introduced a few things, particularly the reindeer. They didn't have any predators, found it good foraging, and they increased without a predator to fill the space available. So although maybe only a couple of dozen to start with, by the end there were about 7,000. And they were in poor condition because they were limited by the food, so it wasn't great. And they were destroying habitats and introduced grass. You can see the meadow grass here that was thriving on being grazed, pushing the native grasses out of the way. And you can see this exclosure that was built in the 1970s. The reindeer weren't able to graze inside, and it's got completely different vegetation from the area outside where the reindeer had grazed. The whalers and the government people who were put in the station in the island to run it, they also introduced plants. They They brought fodder for livestock. They had horses, cows, pigs and sheep at various times for food for the whaling stations. And they also brought Norwegian soil down to bury people in Norwegian soil on the cemeteries. And all that brought a whole load of seeds. For instance, here we're harvesting dandelion plants, and they've run riot across the whole island as well. There are other invasive plants, and Captain Cook is, and other invasive animals as well. And I'll tell you about the worst of those and what we've done about it. Captain Cook said not a tree was to be seen, nor a shrub even big enough to make a toothpick. It was all pretty low-lying stuff. And here you can see a good view of South Georgia. There's the ice and the mountains, then pretty scrubby land. And the biggest plant really is the tussock grass. You can see it's quite a lush grass, quite big, but that's as big as it gets. In the background, you can see it's a habitat for nesting giant petrels. They get the shelter there. And you can see on the top left, there's a nest of the South Georgia pipit. And so they're nesting right down at ground level. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a burrow. The small prions and petrels burrow into the ground. And again, they're living down at ground level because there are no trees. Now, everybody who arrived on the island by ship, particularly in the earlier days, there were many shipwrecks. And in those days, ships all had rats. And with the result, many, many rats were washed ashore onto this island and found lots to eat. So about 3/4 of the island ended up infested by rats. They could get down into the burrows, and so it had a massive effect on all the breeding birds. So that's the bad things that people have done. How's South Georgia governed? Who's in charge around here? Well, it's British territory. So the Queen is the head of state, though she's never visited. We have had Princess Royal a couple of times has come down. Back in the 1950s, Prince Philip visited. But really they delegate the running to the Foreign Office of the United Kingdom government, and then they devolve it again to a commissioner. So because South Georgia really doesn't have its own population, the government is done in the Falkland Islands, even though the Falklands is a separate overseas territory. So the governor of the Falklands is also the commissioner of South Georgia. So it's one person, but he's got 2 sets of headed notepaper, 2 sets of rubber stamps, and 2 completely separate governments that run the 2 territories for him. There's no population in South Georgia and Falklands, so there's no scope for democracy. So it's much more guided by Britain, who make various commitments to international schemes of management, particularly on the biological side. So the Convention on Biological Diversity, CAMLA, an international commission that manages Antarctic fisheries, the agreement on the conservation of albatrosses and petrels, and a number of other agreements and international things that make South Georgia, that frame how South Georgia is managed. So there's a small staff in Stanley, although the commissioner has 2 jobs. He has a team with a chief executive, an operations manager, a visits and biosecurity officer, and a couple of people managing the fishery based in Stanley. And then a much smaller team in South Georgia. So there are 3 government officers, and this is the job that I used to do. At any one moment, there are 2 of the government officers on the island, and they do everything to do with visiting ships, which is therefore everybody who visits, whether they be fishermen, tourists, yachts people, visiting scientists. Their activities are guided by the government officers on behalf of the government. So the sort of work they do is to go on board every ship, do the paperwork. Customs and immigration is an important part of sovereignty. Make sure that the fishing vessels are all set up to operate according to the rules and regulation. A lot of biosecurity work now, so making sure that the ships don't have rats on board. And here I am checking a bait station on a visiting cruise ship once. And they're also doing the fisheries inspections, so making sure the fishing vessels that turn up are set up to fish legally. So the economy is quite small, somewhere in the region of about £10 million a year, and it's kept in South Georgia. So the money that comes in stays in the South Georgia pot, just as I'm sure you're aware with most of the other overseas territories. The idea is that they're encouraged to be as self-sufficient as possible. But that money does stay in the South Georgia pot. It's not siphoned away to the United Kingdom to be spent on everything up here. Main income is from fishing, about £8 million a year from fishing licenses. Then tourism, so there's a small charge made on somewhere in the region of 8 to 10,000 passengers on cruise ships who visit each year. So that brings in somewhere between £1 million, £1.5 million a year. And then there's a post office that sells a lot to visiting ships, but also an important part of the sovereignty is to maintain a proper postal service, which is what they do. I'm just going to mention the fishing briefly because it is so important. In the 1980s, Soviet trawlers started taking the krill. So the international community, as part of the Antarctic Treaty System, took control of that and set up an international commission that took control of the fishery and set limits. And the South Georgia government uses those limits to manage it sustainably, not only to make sure there's enough fish of each species left to recover to be fished in following years, but also that there's enough fish left for all the predators, so the seals and the fish that eat each other, they've got to have enough food. And then the fishing vessels have to be managed in such a way that they're not damaging the ecosystem. So for instance, on bottom right here, long lining vessels have to deploy streamer lines which frighten albatrosses and other birds away from the stern of the ship. And on the left here, we've got weights that we're weighing to make sure that the lines sink quickly, with the result that the baited hooks are no longer available to the birds, and that albatross mortality was reduced to 0. And so the fishery has earned a Marine Stewardship Council certification, which is a completely independent, very high standards of certification, just to give us confidence that it's managed to a very high standard and it's sustainable. And if you're ever wondering which fish to buy in a shop, and if you see that MSC logo, go for that, because that will give you confidence. So it was back to the island story. It was pretty well damaged, although it's very robust, so not overly damaged by all those bad things that we did. But by the mid-60s, we stopped hunting for whales, and those species are recovering already. The seals we've stopped hunting, they've been protected, and fur seals have recovered from near extinction without any intervention. Elephant seals always were managed at a reliable level, so that's okay. But we've still had the problem of the introduced reindeers and the rodents, the rats in particular, and the invasive plants. So in 2011, a massive project started to get rid of the rats, but before that could happen, the deer had to go. So the South Georgia government got in some Norwegian experts, and they rounded up the deer and disposed of them. And we're already able to see in exclosures like this one, where the deer hadn't been able to get in, the recovery of the vegetation. You can see the tussock grass is now starting to grow outside. So within a couple of years of eradication of the reindeer, the vegetation is starting to recover. So going back to the rat story, the area of the island was divided up into a number of sectors, each separated by glaciers, which meant that the rats weren't able to move from one to the other. So an eradication was possible by doing one of these sections at a time, and you didn't have to do the whole island in one go. They used helicopters with hoppers underneath to systematically spread poison bait across the entire vegetated area of the island, up and into the edge of all the ice sheets. So it's quite a lot of area, especially formulated bait with help from the Bell Laboratories. And the helicopters had to fly very, very straight lines. So you can see each of these red lines was taken from GPS recordings on the helicopters. So they covered all the ground over 3 separate summers. So 2011, 2013, 2015, and then went away again to let any rats that were there, give them 2 years to recover, in which case they would be detectable. And then in the 2017-18 summer, we spent 6 months, and I joined the South Georgia Heritage Trust's monitoring team for this. We spent 6 months combing the island, putting in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of monitoring stations like this, which is a little wooden stake soaked in oil and with a wax tag and a cardboard corrugated board on it, soaked in peanut butter, which rats love. And the idea was that we'd leave this for a month or two. Any rats would find it and chew it, leaving obvious signs such as this wax tag, and so we would know that the rats were there. We also had 3 dogs operating with us over the last 3 months, and they covered huge areas of ground. At the end of the whole thing, we were absolutely convinced that there were no rats left. The project had been completely successful. Whilst we were doing the project, we were looking in each of the 120, 130 sites that we visited for small birds. And in every single site, we saw pipits that had recovered within a very few years. And the pintail ducks we saw in much, much larger numbers than I can remember seeing them in all the time I was there. So again, very good indication. So the reindeer have gone, the rats have gone. Government are also working on introduced plants. So they have a group of specialists who come in every summer, and they're combing the island looking for introduced plants. Some are too late. The dandelions are so well spread, and they use wind, which there's lots of, so they're not really able to control them, but they have managed to control a lot more plants. So South Georgia's reverting a lot more. And the lesson learned really is that it takes a lot of expense to reverse the damage that we do in a place like this. And so the big lesson we've learned is to get in there and stop stuff getting introduced in the first place. So now there's a very, very strong biosecurity protocols. Anyone going ashore has to clean their boots and make sure they're well scrubbed when they go ashore and when they come back onto the ship. You're not allowed to bring food ashore in case it's got salad, etc. in it. And very strict regulations on bringing in animals and plants to the island. And that's not just visitors, that's the residents as well. So the scientists and the government people, as soon as they arrive to start their tours, they have to go right through every piece of equipment they've got and give it a good check to make sure they're not bringing any insects or plant seeds or, you know, who knows, even mice that could get into your baggage. So biosecurity has become very, very strong. And the big thing there is to take it upstream. So they're now searching ships in Stanley before they even leave for the Falkland, leave for South Georgia, with Sammy, the dog on the right, is a specially trained rat detection dog. And he works in Stanley on all the cruise ships and the fishing vessels heading for South Georgia, with the idea that they would find any rat infested ships before they got into the area. So a lot of protection going on, which is really important. So we're now reaching a very special time in South Georgia's history. The damage and exploitation has stopped. The major parts of the exploitation and the damage is being reversed and it's recovering. It's a really, really special time, and I'm very, very lucky to have been here, part of it, and seeing it recover. So how can you go? That's the big question. It's a very, very special place, and really great that lots of people get to go. There are a few ways. You could go by yacht. There are professional charter yachts that operate either out of the Falklands or South America. And if you've got a few weeks, you can have a very uncomfortable journey across some of the worst oceans in the world, but a very special experience once you get there. Or you could get a job on a fishing ship or on a government ship. Again, pretty desperate measures to go to if you're really keen. But I wouldn't recommend it myself. And you don't really get to see much of the ground itself. You just spend a lot of time at sea. You can come in an expedition. So every few years, a group of people come down, say, with kayaks to paddle around the island. And every year, 1 or 2 or 3 groups come down, deployed by ships, and do land-based expeditions. This is me back in 1999 doing an expedition where we did well, in fact, we skied and walked the entire length of the island. A real treat to be able to do something like that. Another way of visiting the island is to be in the BBC. That way you get lots of money thrown at you to bring lots of very heavy equipment down and camp in a very, very lovely place and try and get some special footage. But again, that's not really available to most people. But one thing that is really possible, and I know at least one of your members, I remember, has been on a trip with us, is to come by expedition cruise ship. Small ships, and I think Chris is going to tell you a bit more about it in a short while, but it's a much more comfortable way of visiting. Comfortable ship, lots to see from the ship when you're at sea. Very, very likely to see whales in the area now. They're recovering really well. And you can go ashore. We'll take you ashore on the small boats so you can visit the big animal colonies that we saw earlier, as well as visit Grytviken and the abandoned whaling station where there's the small museum, and the staff there can show you around and tell you a bit about the history. And then we'll take you to the larger wildlife colonies and make sure that the visits are managed properly so that you can get the best experience, but without compromising the lives and the breeding success of the birds and the penguins and the seals there. But a very, very special experience. You don't have to be there very long before you see some really amazing sights. And you don't have to go ashore. Some places will just take you and tour you around by the small boats, which means you can get up close to animals on ice or go and see the whales. This picture is actually down in the Antarctic, but I've thrown it in because I just noticed Benedict here, who is one of your members. I hope he's here tonight. If so, hi Benedict. Hope you got home all right. So that is a very, very brief whiz around South Georgia, its history, what's special about it, how it's governed, and how you might get there. So thanks very much for listening, and I'll hand you back over.
Thank you very much, Pat. And that was, yeah, really, really good to hear about what, obviously, I've learned a lot more about South Georgia, so thank you. And I'm now going to, over to you, Lucia. I'll let you, obviously, go ahead and do the next, introduce our next speaker.
Thanks, Philip. I'll pass over to Chris, who will run us through a bit more of the particulars about the sorts of adventures Cork Expeditions offer.
Okay, perfect. Is my screen showing? Just to make sure it all worked all right.
I think Pat, if you can just stop sharing your screen, and then we should hopefully.
There is no webinar without technical difficulties. Wouldn't be the same.
There we go.
Yes. There we go. Yep.
Okay. Are we good? You guys can hear me?
Yep.
All right. Perfect. Well, I already been introduced by the team. Thank you so much. My name is Chris Bach, and yeah, I'm working more on the business side of expeditions. Having said that, I have had the opportunity to travel to the polar regions. And I used to say in my young age, but I probably need to change that, in my middle age now. I had the opportunity to travel to quite a few places. I've been in the travel industry for almost 20 years. And there's very, very few places in this world that have touched and amazed me as much as the polar regions have, including South Georgia and the Falkland Islands. It is really, really hard to put it into words. And that's why I feel very fortunate to have the job to tell people and encourage people to try one of these experiences themselves. So, my presentation is stuck. Oh, now it's working, sorry. And so, yeah, that's me in Antarctica, first time down in the peninsula. But tell you a little bit more about Cork Expeditions. So we already have somebody on the call that's traveled with us, so they can probably hopefully vouch for the amazing experiences that we stand for. But just to give you a little bit of a background of who we are, in 1990, two American gentlemen had the vision to take people onto the top of the world. So they chartered an icebreaker to then in 1991 take the first expedition cruise on top of the world, 90 degrees north to the geographic North Pole. And ever since, in the last 30 years, we've really pride ourselves to take people exclusively to the polar regions and take our travelers as close to the destination and provide them one of the most life-changing, unique experiences that you can possibly experience while you're in the destinations. We are also really pride ourselves in when it comes to sustainability and responsible travel. And Pat was talking a lot about, the positive impact that has been made by researchers and scientists to, you know, revive the beautiful nature that places like South Georgia have to visit. And Quark Expeditions and a lot of donations that we have collected over the course of the years from our travelers on board our ships has definitely gone to the rat eradication project that he's been talking about. But we also try to, you know, run ships with the lowest emission possible, eliminate any single-use plastic, and really have the least negative impact to make sure that we maintain the polar regions in its beauty, and that, you know, our grandchildren can still hopefully travel to these amazing places. So that's really close to our heart as well. Really important when you go on an expedition trip, the smaller the ship, probably the better the experience is. Obviously, when it gets really small, the waters become more choppy. If it's a little bit larger, like 150 to 200 passengers, it starts becoming a bit more pleasant experience. But at Quark Expeditions, all of our ships are under 200 passengers to be able to access the remote places that we want to visit, and also to provide really intimate experiences. So this is one of our traditional expedition ships, the Ocean Adventurer. She takes 128 passengers, really, really intimate experience. We still refurbished it 2 years ago to provide a bit more of a comfortable experience. And then we're really excited to launch our brand new purpose-built for the polar region expedition ship. So these are still renderings because the ship's currently being built in Croatia, and it's due to have its maiden voyage in May 2021, so next year. So from November onwards, we can take travelers on board the Ultramarine to the polar region. She's going to provide our travelers with a little bit more of a luxury experience while still staying true to, you know, exploring the amazing destinations. With 199, she's still a very small ship, but the cabins are larger. Lots of them have balconies, lots more amenities on board, like a yoga room, a fitness center, a spa, an extra restaurant, etc. So, you know, if you like to travel a little bit more lush, then the Ultramarine is definitely an experience for you. It also has 2 helicopters on board, which will allow us to access parts of the polar regions that we haven't been able to do so. Having said that, South Georgia is one of the few regions where we are not allowed to operate them to protect the environment. But if you go to the Falkland Islands or to Antarctica, you will have flight seeing on board of helicopters available. So that's pretty. So for you who may have never thought about what's an expedition trip, or ever thought of going on a cruise ship, even though this is nothing to do with a traditional cruise, I kind of want to explain you a little bit of what a day on an expedition would be like. So first of all, no day is ever like the one before, and I'm sure Pat can vouch for that. Hardly any day is ever the way you have planned it, because we obviously, in the most remote areas of the world, we deal with weather. And so while this may sound like a bit unpredictable, it's part of the experience, and it makes these adventures so much more exciting and so much more fun. So when we talk about these trips, we tell you what we want to do with you, but sometimes we do even lots more on different things, and it's just really, really dynamic way of traveling. So our trips are very inclusive, so we try to make sure to get you off the ship at least twice a day when we are in destination, and sometimes even a third time. And we also keep you very busy when we are on open sea days, and in the evening as well. So while we are in destination, Pat was touching on it already, it's really all about the wildlife, the history, and nature. So we do a lot of wildlife watching. There's lots and lots of opportunities to take great photography, especially in South Georgia in the king penguin colonies. There's no other place in the world like it. We try to get you walking a bit, hiking when possible, all depending on your abilities. So you don't have to be super fit. These are not expeditions where you have to canoe for 20 days across an ocean. This is expeditions for people who want to explore and still be comfortable at the same time and have an adventure. Pat also was touching on the zodiacs already. these are our lifeline to the destination, because all the places that we go to most of the time don't have a port. So to be able to access all the amazing landing sites, the wildlife, we need the Zodiacs to get us there, but we also use them as a platform to observe wildlife. So yeah, you become really acquainted and familiar with the Zodiacs, and they're really a lot of fun. Then the most single pride of our company and our little operations are our guides on board. And so I've traveled quite a bit, I've met a lot of people, but whenever I meet somebody that comes from our ship, I always think they're like the most amazing and the most interesting people I've ever met. And I've only met Pat 2 days ago, but I'm already like put to shame because I thought I've experienced a little bit in my life, but it's nothing compared to the guides that work on board our ship. They are the most experienced in the industry. Some of them have been there since day one. We have Bob Hatland, who still comes to the North Pole with us every year, and he's been doing that for 30 years. I think Pat has a few years under his belt as well, working with us. And so our guides, they are geologists, they're biologists, they're photographers, they're amazing and super interesting and fun people. And I don't know, I feel like I just want to be friends with them. I just want to hang out with them. So while they provide us with such an amazing experience, they are really, really fun to be around. And they give us lectures while we travel on sea days, and they also give us recaps about what we've seen during the day. And they also give us an idea of what we hopefully be doing tomorrow. And if that changes, they tell us that as well. So they're really the ones that make these trips happening. And, you know, while most of them will be very, very modest when they talk about it, yeah, the rest of us who don't work as guides, we are just all in awe of them. Oh. My presentation is stuck again. Okay. They also spend pretty much 24 hours on board the ship to keep an eye out wildlife, not just during working hours from 9 to 5. They do it at 11 o'clock at night. They do it at 2 o'clock in the morning. And if they see something super exciting, they may wake you up because we don't really want you to miss out. So I always say have some decent pair of pajamas with you and some comfortable shoes, so you can just jump out of bed, put on your parka, and run outside to make sure you don't miss out of whales, or if you ever end up traveling to the north, polar bears, or any kind of exciting wildlife. So, and yeah, so while you're on board the ship, we keep you busy, and we also feed you really well. So 3 meals a day and an afternoon tea, so really 4. Coffee, tea, water, soft drinks, pretty much 24/7, and a nice glass of wine at dinner or a beer if that's what your preference. So yeah, so we make sure we feed you really, really well so that you're nice and strong to enjoy all your experiences. And then for the people that are really adventurous, we have a couple of optional activities, such as camping in Antarctica. And with the Ultramarine, we have heli hiking and exclusive heli landings. You don't have to book these, they just for people who just want to do a little bit more. This is me kayaking in Antarctica. Hold on. There. You can totally tell it's me. But this is probably one of the most amazing experiences that I've ever had in my life. And Pat probably goes like, yeah, I've seen that many, many times. But if you've only been once or twice in your life, you will never ever forget that moment. And it still gives me like goosebumps, even at like 28 degrees at 10 p.m. at night. We also offer stand-up paddleboarding and kayaking, I said already. So there are activities for people who are like a little bit extra adventurous, I'd say. And then I'm not going to bore you with Quark Adventures like 50 different itineraries. I just wanted to point out a couple that we have that can take you to South Georgia, just to give you a little bit of an idea what it would look like. So normally you would travel somewhere, well, if you are in the UK or anywhere else in the world, you travel to Buenos Aires first. From Buenos Aires, you fly down to Ushuaia, which is the most southern city of South America. And then you embark on the ship and we take you to South Georgia. We spend a few days around South Georgia. And then most of our itineraries at least include the Antarctic Peninsula as well, because if most people go all the way that way, they want to go see the 7 continents as well. So that would take about 16 days. If you have a little bit longer time, then we have options that include the Falkland Islands as well, of 20, 23 days, just to give you a bit of an idea. And the year of 2021, so the upcoming year, is quite exciting because we have a few special itineraries as well. So the 100-year anniversary of the last journey of Shackleton took place. So we have a Shackleton dedicated itinerary. And also the solar eclipse will take place in December 2021. And from what what I've been told, this is probably the last time we can see a solar eclipse in the Antarctic region or in the southern hemisphere, that far south, in all of our lifetimes, given that we live a normal life. So that's an option. So yeah, that's just a little bit of an introduction of what the Quark expedition would be like. How like a normal person can make it happen to go to South Georgia. And so if you have any questions, just please let me know. And yeah, if you have any questions, also we have an email address down here and a phone number, and we have a lovely team across the world as well. So if you have lots and lots of questions, they're on the phones for you 24/7 to answer them. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. I really appreciate that you took your time tonight.
Right, thank you so much, Chris. That was fantastic. We do have quite a few questions. Yeah, I mean, I'll pass over to Lucia in a second, but how much does it cost? Is my question. What's the?
Well, I mean, it really depends, right? So it depends when you go, which ship you take.
Yeah.
But I'd say for like the 16-day trip, including airfare, we're looking at probably about 14,000 to 15,000 pounds per person. If you just go to Antarctica, which obviously is not what we've been talking about predominantly tonight, with 10 grand, including airfare, you can make it happen. But obviously, the larger your cabin, the longer your trip, it's maybe a little bit more.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Interesting. I thought it'd be in my head. I had between 10 and 20. So yeah, that's. Thank you for answering that. Lucia, I'll pass over to you now because we had quite a few questions through, haven't we, Lucia? If you want to put forward a few.
Yeah. Thanks, Philip, and thanks very much, Chris, for your presentation. So I'll read off some of the questions that we've had in the meeting chat. Pat, thank you very much for responding to some of them on by text directly in the meeting chat, but I hope you don't mind that I'll read some of them out and maybe you can respond verbally as well and maybe give us a bit more context. So the first question was submitted by Robert, asked who runs the post office.
So the post office is run by the South Georgia government. In the summer, they have a postal officer. For the last few years, it's been Vicky, who actually got married on the island a couple of years ago. She's just busy all day, every day with just all the cruise ships that visit. So she has a little post office that opens behind the museum at Grytviken. Then in the winter, when there's just the smaller team there, the government officers who do everything else as well, they run the post office and make sure the mail keeps coming and going, because that, again, that's an important part of the sovereignty deal, is that you have to maintain a working postal service.
Thank you. Thanks, Pat. Super. So the next question was, how much does the population change between summer and winter?
So the population, yes, it does flux rather. In the winter, well, there are two populations. In the northwest of the island, there's a small island which is just a couple of miles long, Bird Island. There are 4 wintering scientists there, and they're monitoring the breeding and the survival success of the seals and the wandering albatross and other albatross species as well. And in the main settlement at King Edward Point, which is right next to Grytviken in the middle of the island, that's where the government officers are supported by the British Antarctic Survey team. And in the winter, there's about about a dozen people there altogether. So that includes the 2 government officers and their partners. There will be 2 scientists who are also doing fishery research and top predator research to tie into the fisheries work. A mechanic, an electrician, a boating officer who has to look after the boats, train everyone else up to drive the boats to get the government officers out to ships, etc. So there's about a dozen in winter. Then in summer that expands a lot with the visiting scientists, handover teams, the museum team, which can be in a busy year up to 5 people. There's the weed control people, usually 2, 3, 4 of them. Building and maintenance team, that can be between half a dozen and a dozen, depending on the tasking there. So it can go up to 30. And in a really busy year, if there's a big project, for instance, last summer, they completely rebuilt the jetty with external contractors. So at times there would have been somewhere in the region of 30 or 40 people in the settlement. But they all go come April, May, and the end of the summer season, and then it goes down to the nice quiet time in the winter of about a dozen.
Super. Thank you very much, Pat, for that. So David Adam asks, when did the last whaling station close and have they been dismantled?
The whaling station operated from 1905 and the last one at Grytviken closed in 1965, and Leith was about the same time as well. They weren't dismantled. They've just been left to fall down. Doing anything to the stations is very expensive. In about 2003, 2004, the Grytviken whaling station had to have a lot of work done on it, mainly because it was insulated with lots of asbestos, and as the buildings were falling apart, this was being released into the environment directly upwind of the settlement, which wasn't a very good idea. So a very expensive project came in and took all the buildings apart and took them down and took the machinery apart to get the asbestos out. While they were at it, they also removed a lot of heavy fuel oil from the remaining ships and the tanks, so that they're all cleaned up at Grytviken now. Unfortunately, the history of the site, so the industrial history was maintained, so a lot of the machinery, which is still quite interesting to look at, and gives a scale of the activity that was going on this little island in the middle of nowhere a century ago, they've been kept. So it's now possible to walk around Grytviken and get a feel for the industry. But fortunately, the whaling isn't happening anymore. And the cost of dismantling any more of the stations is just money the government doesn't have. And if they had that much money, there are better things they could spend it on. So now the other stations have just been declared out of bounds with a 200-metre protection zone around them.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Pat. So Catherine asks, do you see the Southern Lights from South Georgia?
Do we see the Southern Lights? Unfortunately, I never saw them in South Georgia. It's not that far south. It's 54, 55 degrees south. So that's about the equivalent of Northern England. So when you get a really active auroral period, you could see them, but there's mountains all around. So you can only really see upwards in the winter, and it's very often cloudy anyway, so the chances of seeing the Southern Lights unfortunately are rather slim in South Georgia. You could do, but I never did.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Pat. I've actually got a question for you, Pat, and then Chris, I hope it's okay if I'll turn to you as well for a question particularly about the expedition. Pat, for you, does South Georgia receive support from the UK government? I'm not sure if maybe I missed that.
Support from the UK government. It's a lot, sort of not direct cash injection. There is a lot of the cost of running, say, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office infrastructure in Stanley. That's partly borne by UK government, and for particular projects, so science work, the reindeer eradication, the rodent eradication, you could bid for funds from UK bodies, government bodies, so Darwin Initiative, DEFRA put quite a bit of money into the, I think about $500,000, something like that, into the rodent eradication. But generally, as with all the overseas territories, they're expected to run on their own 2 feet. And fortunately, there is enough income in South Georgia that it can support itself. But if it came to it, well, for instance, tourism is likely to decrease quite a bit this coming year, and if fishing were to take a dive, and that would be, for instance, if the government decided on their scientific advice that the fish stocks were dropping a bit, then they would hesitate. They wouldn't hesitate to just stop the fishing or reel it right back to protect the fish stocks and the ecosystems. That's their #1 priority. In which case, one would hope the British government would then come up with some emergency funding, but generally it's expected to fund itself.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Pat. I've gone through all the questions on the meeting chat, so if anyone else has any other questions to post, please do post them there. We've probably got about 5 more minutes left to go through Q&A, but I will share a contact details in follow-up email, so if you don't want to ask now, you can always ask them.
Yeah, sorry, can I just ask, I don't know if he wants to do it, but if Benedict, if you want to unmute yourself, do you want to share any of your thoughts having been on one of these fantastic tours?
Hey, Philip. First of all, Adrian, Pat, good to see you again. I hope you're well. But thanks, Philip. Yeah, well, I think, as I think I said in the chat, I went down to the Falklands, South Georgia and Antarctica with a Quark back in 2019. It really is it's worth every penny. It really is a really incredible place. And South Georgia, we had a bit of a rough time, and Pat, you might remember we were basically in the eye of the storm while we were there. Yeah. We had a pretty rough weather, but it was sorry about the background noise. One of my parents looking after the grandchildren. We had some pretty rough weather, but it really is quite an incredible place. As you see from the wildlife on there.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Benedict. And yes, it does sound absolutely fantastic. Actually, can I ask Chris, will the cost you've discussed, will that change at all with the new cruise ship? Or is that...
Yeah, I mean, so obviously there are differences in terms of which vessel you choose to. So if you were to choose to book on the Ocean Adventurer, the first ship that I showed you, it tends to be 15% cheaper or so. But like I said, it really depends on the time of the year. So if you go in the mid of the season, which is the end of December, January, or if you go in November or March, which is the shoulder seasons, and then sometimes we have a discount that is really attractive. But yeah, I mean, the Ultramarine is definitely at a higher price point because it comes with a just more luxury kind of comfort.
Yeah. Okay.
But both options are available, so it's not either or.
Okay. Thank you. And we do have on the line, we actually do have a geologist on the line, Greg Rodwell. I don't know if Greg has anything he wants to ask. He's
what is the geology of South Georgia?
I'll leave that to you, Pat.
Yeah, the geology. So it's essentially part of the Andes. So I'm not a geologist, although I've pretended to be a few times. But it's sedimentary rock that's built up and then gone down deep, been metamorphosed into lovely folded layers of rock. So it's very beautiful. No gold, no oil.
Nice.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for that. If anyone else wants to just ask a verbal question, feel free to unmute yourself. I'm happy for that.
We have got one more question, Philip, on the meeting chat from David. I assume to Pat, asking what happened to the reindeer?
Yeah, the reindeer, as I briefly mentioned, they had to be eradicated before the rat eradication could work. And so over 2 summers, they were, well, in the first summer, Sami herders from northern Norway were brought in, and they gathered up a lot of them, slaughtered them under veterinary supervision, and then the South Georgia government chartered a freezer trawler with a portable abattoir on board. So a lot of the deer meat was frozen and packaged for human consumption and was sold through agents in the Falklands. In the second year, there just wasn't the capability to do that. So they were just shot in place, and the scavenging birds very soon found them and had a very, very nice summer of it. In a couple of places, interestingly enough, we saw where reindeer corpses had gone and then rotted down, the plant life and the grasses really grew up. They were a lot of nutrients went from the corpses back into the ground and fertilized the tussock grass and the native grasses in those places. So most of the reindeer went back into the ecosystem.
Thanks very much, Pat. Just a last question I had of, I think these. Sorry, I hope you can all hear me okay.
Yeah.
Just one last question I had actually, I suppose for Chris, but maybe Pat as well. The typical journey, you said it can be around a 16-day tour. I believe, Pat, when I had my initial chat with you, you said that the journey to get from the Falkland Islands to South Georgia can roughly take, I believe you said, around 2 to 3 days, but it depends on the weather and the sea. And that sometimes, things can take quite a bit longer. What is the typical sort of journey time to get to South Georgia itself?
Yeah, so a typical journey, so on one of the Cork ships, will start in Ushuaia and take about a day and a half to get to the Falklands. Then we'll have 2 or 3 days in the Falklands, and then another 2 or 3 days at sea to South Georgia. The ships tend to go a little bit faster than the government ships that are having to watch out for fuel costs, whereas our priority is to get people on their trips and see as much as possible in the time available. And then 3 or 4 days around South Georgia, another couple of days at sea down to the peninsula, a few more days around the peninsula, and then another day or so at sea, 1 or 2 days at sea, getting back up to Ushuaia. So you do get the sea days, and particularly after 4 days on South Georgia, when we get you up first thing in the morning, fill you up with breakfast very quickly, get you ashore, beast you uphill, down Dale, take you for Zodiac rides, back on board for some lunch, back ashore, more activities. After 4 days of that, you need a couple of days rest, if nothing else, just to go through all your photographs. So the sea days aren't wasted time. There's plenty to do there. And as Chris explained, we'll do lectures and talks, either longer talks, but also little chats, and the staff, we're always around, so you can just grab us and talk about anything you want to know as well. So although there is time at sea, it's not lost time, it's well spent.
And if you're one of the people that don't enjoy the waves that much, we do transmit all the talks into the cabins as well. So if you don't want to be in public spaces, you can just chill in your cabin and listen to Pat and his mates talk about all the exciting things as well. So
that's very bespoke. That's great. Any other questions that have come through this year? Are we?
No, that's everything from me. Thanks very much, Chris and Pat.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much. And normally, if this was a physical event, we would give you a round of applause. But no, really interesting. I think I know for a fact, knowing some of the people that are on the call tonight, they will certainly be considering heading away on one of these expeditions. So myself included. So yes, we'll watch this space. Just want to finally pass over to our merchandise officer, Gus Eldridge, and then we'll officially wrap up. Gus, over to you.
Thank you, Phil, and to our 2 excellent speakers this evening. It was really fantastic. Just a reminder to everyone that we have some excellent, fantastic merchandise on our online shop. Just to give you a flavour of what we have a Fotbot branded mug like the one I've got here, which you can have at your workstation. We have Fotbot ties, we've got some excellent books, and we also have our newest edition, which is a Fotbot 2021 calendar, where we have photos of the majority of our 16 overseas territories, including the King Penguin on South Georgia. If you want to see the others, I'm afraid you're going to have to order your own copy. But they're available on the Fotbot shop. So if any of those items interest you, get ordering.
Yeah, and there's a 10% discount, suffice it to say, for Fotbot members. So if you're unsure what the code is and you are a member, just message Gus or myself, and we will make sure you have that. So yeah, thank you, Gus. And I think we'll wrap up now. So Lucia, do you want to officially wrap up tonight's event?
Yeah, thanks very much, Ben. Thanks very much, Pat and Chris, again, for spending your time to talk us through all about South Georgia and the fascinating polo adventures that Cork Expeditions offer. As I said at the end, I will send a follow-up email with some contact details so that members can get in contact with you, Chris, if they would like to inquire a bit more. And
we will have this event available. We have, as we do with all our webinars, it will be available on demand. So that we're some point, probably tomorrow now, a link will be posted. I will obviously make sure, Pat, Chris, you get a copy of that link so you can share it to anyone. We do have almost 18,000 followers on our Facebook page, so we will send that to them as well. So you could say we have the full dedicated disciples of Fotbot on this call, but we also have, as I say, about 18,000 casual viewers who will watch this in their own time. So fantastic. So thank you so much again. And anyone who's not a member of Fotbot, though, obviously please do join up. Our next event will hopefully be on the Falkland Islands Museum. We do want to do our first physical event some point this year, but Lucia will be in touch with that. If anyone has any comments, suggestions, anything you're unsure about, please do message me directly, philip.smith@fotbot.org. Otherwise, thank you all again, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening or morning/afternoon, because obviously we've got some people from America on the line. So thank you all. Wish you all
again.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much for having us.
Thank you.